of what the silence is about. And she finally decided to talk to them, and her rehearsal was that giving an interview to me. So the interview that we did, she has also written about this, was a rehearsal for finally talking to her sons who were in their 40s, late 30s, and had grown up with this terrible memory. The other thing is poverty. The only thing that all the victims have in common is their gender. They were all male. Other than that, class, politics, age, background, they're not even all Italians. You know, some of them were Jewish refugees that thought they would be safer in Italy. So, because it was a massacre of men, it has become a memory of women. And the women, back then, we're talking about the 40s. Well, this was, you know, the bygone age where one man's earnings could support a family of a wife and 4 children. So the women didn't work. Didn't work outside the house. And they were forced to go out to work and to support these kids. And the state, the church, to try to find them jobs in basically in all the unskilled sectors of the public sector. You know, phone operators, machine operators, and things like that. And one man says, you know, his mother was working at the state print house. She was breathing lead, and he says, I sucked the lead from her milk. But he means it also metaphorically. The anger, the despair, and many of these women talk about, flew from the milk into the mouths of these little children. Those who were old enough were placed in orphanages. And they grew up away from, you know, the mother could come see them every week or so. And, you know, orphanages, the food was scarce, the discipline was tough. So they suffered a lot, these little kids. But even those who didn't, Gabrielas says, I heard my little schoolmates talk about, my father did this, my father did that, my father slapped me the other day and said, I wish I had a father I could be slapped by my father. Yeah. The absence, they all grew up with this absence, and not you know, the sadness of being sent away. And I didn't know why. Now I understand that I didn't understand. I knew it happened. I only sensed this great sadness in the family. Everybody cried all the time, the parents, the uncles, and my mother. They were desperate, all this despair. But I was small, I couldn't understand. Being sent away from home like this seems an injustice. When it happened, my brother was 14, my sister 12. They were young, and we were abandoned somehow. So my mother put us in an orphan home. Once in a while she'd come see us, and she always told me that they called her the weeping willow because she went up the stairs laughing and came down crying because she left us behind. And so on. There's plenty of stories about this. The question of working out what happened begins began immediately. It began because now the massacre took place in March. Nobody was really sure whether their loved ones were among the killed. The Germans sent notes in German to the family saying, such and such is dead, come get his things, come to the jail to get his things. In German, many families, especially the Jews, were not at their usual address. They were in hiding, so they didn't get it. And also, you know, there was always a hope that there could be a mistake. So, you know, they spent this month from March to June with between despair and hope. Some people went around asking the families for money so that they could trace their loved one who has been sent to Germany to work, things like that. And they didn't have a body to cry on. And you know, if you don't have a body to cry on, it's very hard to mourn. So when the Allies arrived, the commander of the Allies said, okay, these men, number one, the whole city flocked to the Fosse Ardeatine because everybody knew where it was. Even though the Germans had told the population that the massacre had taken place, but they were hiding the place because they didn't want the people to see what they had done. But everybody knew, so they went. And the idea was, okay, they're already under the earth. We will build a monument on their burial place and leave it at that. And the few wives and a couple of the older daughters went to see General Pollock, the commander, and said, no way, we want recognition. What do they mean by recognition? They meant two things. Number one, we want to make sure that they're there. Number two, we want moral recognition. We want them to be recognized. So in the middle of July, and it's hot in the middle of July in Rome, this heroic Jewish doctor, Ascarelli, began to dig out the bodies from under the earth. But see, the point is, mourning, bereavement, requires a ritual. And burying a person is not like putting a body under the earth. So they had to be unearthed so that they could be reburied with their names recognized. And you can imagine, these bodies had been one on top of the other for 3 months. So it was horrible. And these women, the wives, but sometimes the daughters and the sons, had to identify them. And how do you identify a body like that? They were identified from the clothes they wore. Well, yeah, he had a pair of underpants that I sewed for him. Yeah, he had a broken tooth because I remember he tried to crush a walnut with his teeth and it broke his tooth. I recognized him from that, things like that. And so these children were there at having to deal with this, with these bodies and this unearthing and this reburial, and participating in the ritual of mourning. Now, Rome is an unusual place. Well, most places are unusual, but anyway, Rome is sort of a hinge between central and southern Italy, between the bureaucratic apparatus of the state, the middle class that revolves around that, and the southern rural immigrants that came to build the homes for the middle class to live in when they moved back in from Turin, from Florence. So it's sort of both a bourgeois and a peasant city, or at least it was in 1944, 45. So you had, on the one hand, you had the type of middle class bereavement that, as Stefano described, you only cry inside, you're dignified. And on the other hand, you have the total letting go of the traditional keening for the death, like in Greek tragedy, the weeping, the rhythmic mourning and crying, so that the rhythm could sort of give a little bit of order to the despair, as Ernesto de Martino, who's a major ethnographer of the Italian South, says, mourning is a way of turning the loss into value. And how do you do that? So you have all these complicated ritual where, I'm trying to locate the quote, but anyway. Well, where they talk about seeing people lose control, go out, run them, and sometimes wishing they could do that. So, as Gabrielas says, but this is one of my favorite stories. She says, back in the mid-60s, I called my mother up. I said, Mom, how are you doing? She said, I'm crying. What are you crying for? I'm crying about your father. She says, now, I didn't have time before. I didn't have time before. She worked 3 jobs. She raised 4 daughters. She says, this woman was crazy. She kept running all over the place. And so I says, I said, the terrible thing is that this morning there was no way to, and she said, let me say the monster word. There was no way to enjoy it. There was no way to cry for this dead in peace, because they couldn't afford to. How could a woman sit in the house and cry? What would she eat? Bread and tears? They couldn't. These widows couldn't cry. It was impossible. They had to run. And the children were witnessing this. Also, there's a gender form to this, to the mourning. Women, as usual, were in charge of survival. So they took responsibility. They found jobs. They raised these kids. It was mostly women. Mostly it was wives. A few mothers. The ones that had no way of dealing with this were the fathers. And the fathers were absolutely obsessed with revenge and with a sense of personal failure, because in traditional male culture, you invest in your male son, your own survival. And also you have a sense that, you should protect him. So it's a double failure. I have no progeny, and I have failed my son. And this story may or may not be true. It was told, the person who told it was credible, but I refused to take it literally. One of the fathers lived the rest of his life with his son's skull on his desk. and they sought revenge, which the women weren't interested in. And there's a neat little story about a wife and a sister-in-law, and no, about a sister and a wife, and a sister says, I saw that my sister-in-law was desperate, so I put some kind of something to ease the pain in her soup, so that they would calm her down. And only later I realized she was putting the same thing in mine. So and one aspect of the male working out of this morning is the case of this poet, Aladino Govoni. Aladino Govoni was one of those fourth-rate poets whose verse you learn in elementary school. He had written in praise of Mussolini, mainly because he thought he could make a living that way. He was, and when his son was killed, he wrote this heart-rending poem. There are two versions of the poem. One is in free verse, and a few years later, he put it in meter and rhyme, as if, the disorder of despair had come under some kind of form and control. And he talks about how the whole creation has betrayed him. God, the homeland, the fascists, of course, but the partisans as well. Everybody, everything has killed his son. His nephew talked about this, talked about how obsessed his uncle had been, but he also talked about how the fact that they couldn't talk about it means that he was deprived of a whole chunk of his family history, which is gone. The other thing had to do with the way the city dealt with this, because, as I said, right after the Allies came, the Allies reached Rome on the 4th of June. On the 5th of June, thousands of people walked the 12 miles to the Fosse Ardeatine. However, so there's to be this great feeling of identification with these victims and everything. On the other hand, I mean, Rome had been under the cloud of this military occupation, bombardments. My own earliest memory is being in an air shelter, and hunger, oppression, fear, and now we're free, and butter is back. Now we can eat. Now we can dance. Now we're going back to life. And these 335 women or so, back then, they were full black from head to toe, going around the city to find the means of survival. They going to government offices, going to church relief. Well, they were carrying the signs of death in a city that wants to go back to life. So they were okay as long as they stayed in their place, as long as they stayed at the caves, not if they were in the street. And Gabriela has another story about how her mother went down to the grocery store. Food was still scarce, there were lines, And she came back immediately, and she said, you know, the owner was so nice. As soon as he saw me, he says, come to the head of the line, I'll serve you first. How nice he was. And her mother, the grandmother, says, don't you realize what he did? He doesn't want you there. He doesn't want to see you. So again, this sense that you were discriminated because you were the son of a victim, and the victims were communists. Some were, maybe 40%, but not all the others, because if they killed them, they must have done something wrong, because they meddled with things that they should have left alone, and so forth. You know. And one young man says, you know, I was a teenager, I found a job at a factory, and when they found out who I was, they let me go, and I couldn't find a job because I was the son of a communist. He was not the son of a communist, incidentally. He was the son of a socialist, but which is a big difference. So you know, this is the life they went back to. And finally, Rosita Stame. Rosita Stame's father was an opera singer, a rising opera singer. He was also an anarchist, and he was killed. And she says, for a long time, I resented my father. You loved your comrades, you loved your struggle more than you loved us. And there is a sense of resentment. Gabriela says, sometimes I talk to my father. A lot of them dream about them. Many of them never met their parents, their fathers, you know? But they know them in dreams. They dream about them. Settimia Spizzichino, from a Jewish family, she lost 7 relatives in the Fosse Ardeatine and 22 in the extermination camps. And she says, every night they all parade before me, one by one. And they say, have you forgotten us? Have you forgotten us? So, you know, and the question is, what do you do with this memory? Gabriela says, I tell my father, well, why did you have to walk through this fire? Why did you have to get involved with these red things? Red, not just the red flag, red the fire. Couldn't you just, like all those other fools, couldn't you just put on your black shirt, go to the square and cheer that fool up there, and think of your family first? But then she talks about how when she went to the Fosse Ardeatine, she was so proud that her father's name was on the golden book of names, and she would always go through the book and find her father's name. And she says it was shining, not golden, shining, gilded. Now the gilt is faded, but it's still there. And Fiamma Montezemolo, the daughter of an important aristocrat from Piedmont, as I said, the family that owned Ferrari, she talked about the glory of seeing her father's body wrapped in the flag, in the national flag. And Gabriella, I had a life with so many problems. I married young, and so many times when I was missing a few liter, then it's a shame. This led me to even be aggressive many times toward my father. And then I regret it. I regret it so much I could die, but I still do. I always say, I wish I could know, why did he have to meddle with these things so red, so absurd? What kind of a life may he have had carrying those weapons around? How could he live this life? I'd like to ask him, didn't you think of your children? A father can't walk all day in the midst of fire. Fire burns. He ought to avoid it sometimes. Why don't you put on a black shirt and go to cheer Mussolini? And on the other hand, Elisabetta Nini, the lawyer, it's part of my life. From my earliest childhood memories, the study in my grandmother's house was really the image of my uncle everywhere. Something I don't know, of which I've always been very proud. The word heroism perhaps has rhetorical connotations, but there was something strongly idealistic in these people, which is something I feel proud of. I had an uncle who was tortured no less than 12 times, who was young and who managed to organize a student movement. So he is one of those minds who brought us to have a democratic system. In other words, I don't think his death was accidental. He says there was some reason why they were there. We were third-class orphans, Gabrielas says. Fourth class, maybe. Because behind our grief, there was hunger, poverty, despair. We were fourth, fifth-class orphans because we were the poor orphans, rejected by all because we were children of communists.